The next question is on the main motion as amended. The question is as follows. Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Motz, moved that the House note A, that the federal carbon tax is causing a debate in the country, and B, that while Quebec, British Columbia and the Northwest Territories already have their own systems in place, the federal government mandates carbon tax policy. That the House call on the Prime Minister to convene an emergency carbon tax and tarification meeting with all of Canada's 14 First Ministers, and that this meeting be publicly televised and held within 5 weeks of this motion being adopted.
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion as amended be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The honourable member from Regina Capel.
I believe we should have a recorded division on this.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion as amended will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Bertol.
Mr. Bertol.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abouteff.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. McCauley Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Stanley.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gourde.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefield Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefield Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot Duval.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Barron.
Miss Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Boudris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Miss Collins Victoria.
Mr. Vong.
Mr. Vong.
All those opposed to the motion as amended will please rise.
Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon Gatineau.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Tassie.
Miss Tassie.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Ms. Ian.
Ms. Ian,
Madame Leboutillier,
Madame Leboutillier,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Madame Petitpas-Taylor,
Ms. Jacek,
Ms. Jazik,
Monsieur Arsenault,
Monsieur Arsenault,
Madame Lalonde,
Madame Lalonde,
Mrs. Romanato,
Mrs. Romanado,
Ms. O'Connell,
Ms. O'Connell,
Mr. Gerritsen,
Mr. Gerritsen,
Mr. Lamoureux,
Mr. Lamoureux,
Monsieur Baptiste,
Mr. Baptiste,
Monsieur Lauzon,
Monsieur Lauzon,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Ms. Dillon,
Ms. Dillon,
Mr. Essassi,
Mr. Assassi,
Monsieur Elkoury,
Mr. El Khoury,
Mr. Fillmore,
Mr. Fillmore,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Johari,
Mr. Johari,
Mr. Sidhu Brampton-East,
Mr. Cedar Brampton East,
Mr. Badaway,
Mr. Badaway,
Mrs. Atwin,
Mrs. Atwin,
Ms. Vandenbeld,
Mrs. Vandenbeld,
Monsieur Sanson,
Monsieur Sanson,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Koutrakis,
Madame Brière,
Madame Brière,
Mr. Fisher,
Mr. Fisher,
Mr. Lightbound,
Mr. Lightbound,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Longfield,
Mr. Longfield,
Monsieur Robillard,
Monsieur Robillard,
Madame Shanahan,
Madame Shanahan,
Miss Cedar Brampton South,
Miss Cedar Brampton South,
Miss Hefner,
Miss Hefner,
Mr. Turnbull,
Mr. Turnbull,
Mr. Sorbera,
Mr. Sorbera,
Mr. Rogers,
Mr. Rogers,
Miss Yip,
Ms. Yip,
Mr. Alday,
Mr. Alday,
Mr. Baker,
Mr. Baker,
Miss Latanzio,
Ms. Latanzio,
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga,
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga,
Madame Mendez,
Madame Mendez,
Mr. Baines,
Mr. Baines,
Ms. Bradford,
Ms. Bradford,
Madame Châtel,
Madame Châtel,
Madame Diab,
Madame Diab,
Madame Lapointe,
Madame Lapointe,
Mr. Miao,
Mr. Meow,
Miss Taylor-Roy,
Ms. Taylor-Roy,
Miss Valdez, Miss Thompson,
Ms. Thompson,
Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
J'aimerais informer la Chambre que
I'd like to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Ms. Zarillo, rather. Ms. Zarillo, your microphone is on mute.
Yes.
Yay pour.
Mr. Wilkinson,
I vote no.
Mr. Wilkinson, nay contre.
Mr. McLean,
I vote for this motion.
McLean, yay pour.
le Bureau va maintenant compiler.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 172, 172. Nays contre 150, 150.
Je déclare la
I declare the motion as amended carried.